Okay, so for everyone out there who, really loves to go deep, like, act as philosophers when it comes to art and beauty,
hmm
this one's for you. Today, we're diving into where philosophy and, well, brain science actually meet.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to figure out how we even have these experiences of beauty. It's not just like airy-fairy thinking. It's about the nitty-gritty of our brains.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And our roadmap for this whole deep dive is a super dense entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's all about aesthetics and cognitive science.
And it's not just philosophy, right? We're talking psychology, linguistics, neuroscience. It's really interdisciplinary.
Totally. But the core idea, like the thread running through all of it, is that our minds are always working, building these internal representations of the world and then interacting with the actual world.
Yeah, so it's about understanding how our experiences shape how we see beauty, what moves us, all of that.
Okay, so mission for today. What can we actually learn from cognitive science that might make us rethink, challenge, maybe even totally upend what philosophers have been saying about art and beauty for centuries?
Right. And to even understand how these fields connect, it helps to look back a bit. The entry points out that those early empiricist philosophers, Shaftesbury, Hume, Reid, they were already thinking about aesthetics in a way that was, grounded in observation and experience.
And then you have those early experiments in psychology, like with Fedner in the Golden section, trying to get at the science of beauty.
Exactly. But then things get interesting because the entry says that for a good chunk of the 20th century, aesthetics sort of became this armchair project, as they put it.
Yeah, like that Wittgenstein quote about how psychology doesn't really tell us much about judging art. It became more about pure thinking, analyzing concepts.
Right. But here's the thing. In recent decades, there's been this huge resurgence of empirical work in aesthetics, driven by a renewed interest in things like imagination and perception.
Okay, so now the big question. How relevant is all this scientific stuff to aesthetics? The entry acknowledges some philosophical skepticism, right?
Yeah, definitely. There's always the concern about, like, hasty generalizations from limited experiments and whether scientists even agree on the findings. Plus, the limits of what science can really tell us about art.
Like Scruton.
Yeah.
Right. He was worried about shoving aesthetic phenomena into scientific boxes that don't fit. Like using Chomsky linguistics to understand music, it just misses the point.
Yeah, and Graham was concerned that focusing too much on science would downplay the role of reason and judgment in aesthetics.
But the entry also offers some pretty strong counterarguments. It points out how studies have found that the reasons people give for their aesthetic judgments often don't actually match what's driving their preferences.
Like Lopes and Irvin have done some fascinating work on this. It really makes you question whether we even know why we like what we like.
Right. And then you have experimental philosophy, which is basically using the tools of experimental psychology to examine those basic concepts philosophers use, like beauty.
Yeah, and that study they mentioned, the one about disagreements about beauty across different cultures, that's really eye-opening. The least popular view was that someone's right and someone's wrong about beauty.
So maybe our everyday intuitions about these concepts aren't as straightforward as philosophers have traditionally assumed.
Exactly. And then there's the whole debate about whether we should form aesthetic opinions based on what others tell us, like relying on experts.
Robson argues that we probably do this more than we'd like to admit, which adds another layer of complexity to the whole idea of aesthetic judgment.
And then you have those even more radical views, like Zeke's, saying that ultimately a true understanding of aesthetics has to be based on what's happening in the brain.
But the entry is careful to point out that just looking at brain activity doesn't automatically tell us what art is or
Yeah.
what's valuable. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
definitely. There's a lot of interpretation involved, and there's still a big debate about what neuroscience can really contribute to our understanding of aesthetics.
Okay, so next up, the entry makes this really helpful distinction: bottom-up versus top-down approaches to aesthetics. So bottom-up is all about those immediate reactions people have, often to pretty simple stimuli, without any kind of special training.
Like, think about your gut reactions to colors, shapes, basic patterns, that sort of thing.
Right, whereas top-down is more about that higher-level stuff, judgment, value, the idea of taste, that's often shaped by experience and education.
And the entry argues that even though these bottom-up studies might seem far removed from philosophy, they're not totally irrelevant. There might be some basic aesthetic responses we all share, regardless of culture or expertise.
Like that classic example they give Wolfland's claim about a preference for right word placement in images. But then later research showed it's way more complicated, influenced by things like handedness and reading direction.
Right. And even though we might find some pretty consistent preferences for certain colors, shapes, or arrangements, those findings can only take us so far in understanding why we admire a complex artwork.
Yeah, liking blue is one thing. Appreciating Picasso is a whole other level. So when it comes to those top-down effects where reasons and judgments come into play, the entry suggests that cognitive science hasn't been as successful in explaining things.
And that might be because aesthetic reasons are just really hard to pin down in any general way, like Sibley pointed out. Plus, there are just so many factors that can influence our judgments.
It's like that idea of isotropy they mentioned. Basically, any piece of information could be relevant to any other, which makes studying thinking and aesthetic thinking in particular really challenging.
Yeah, and while Bolton and Reber have tried to bridge this gap with their psychohistorical model, it faces some criticism, particularly around its focus on perception and the role of art historical knowledge.
So then we get to this idea of processing fluency. Basically, our brains like things that are easy to process. And it's not just limited to aesthetics. Apparently, we find rhymes more believable and fonts easier to read if they're fluent.
But that doesn't mean simple art is always better, right? While fluency can contribute to pleasure, it's not the whole story. The entry raises some concerns, like whether fluency might make us less attentive and whether it really applies to complex works.
And that point about fluency being relative to expectations is really interesting. Like, we enjoy a Bach fugue more if it's more fluent than we expected. But then where do those expectations come from in the first place?
Right, and just saying something is fluent doesn't really give us a reason for admiring it. It seems more about feeling good than about making judgments, which is a crucial part of engaging with art philosophically.
Okay, then there's the mere exposure effect, the idea that we like things more just because we've seen them a bunch of times.
Cutting suggests this might even play a role in shaping the artistic canon. But then you have that counter evidence showing that exposure can lead to more accurate judgments, not just increased liking for everything.
So maybe exposure helps us appreciate the good stuff more and the bad stuff less. It's like our initial reaction might be based on familiarity, but over time we learn to discriminate.
It's a fascinating idea. And then there's predictive processing, this theory that our brains are always trying to predict what's going to happen and minimize errors. Maybe art gives us a workout for our prediction systems, leading to positive feelings.
But why do we need more prediction practice than real life already gives us? It's an interesting question that gets at the heart of what art is for.
And it brings us back to that tension between studying preference scientifically and the philosophical focus on judgment and reasons. Just because we can explain why we like something doesn't mean we've fully understood it aesthetically.
Like the Wittgensteinian critique, right? Explaining the origins of a response isn't the same as a philosophical explanation.
But then the entry pushes us to question the idea of reasons in aesthetics, suggesting that focusing on them too much might actually hinder our judgment.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
So then the entry takes us to art, empathy, and neuroaesthetics. Remember those late 19th century German thinkers who focused on bodily and ecological aspects of aesthetic experience?
Like symmetry, how we move through architecture, Lipsy idea of projecting our feelings onto objects. That stuff's having a comeback with embodied cognition.
Friedberg and Galiz argue that our bodies are actually involved in appreciating art, like we're implicitly mirroring the postures and movements we see.
And there's some evidence from neuroscience about mirror and canonical neurons that supports this idea. But there are also critics who say it neglects higher-level cognitive processes.
And then we have neuroaesthetics, which is all about using brain imaging to study aesthetic experiences. Super exciting, but the entry emphasizes that there's still debate about what it can tell us philosophically.
Yeah, they make that important distinction between the evidential claim and the constitutive claim.
Basically, can brain facts be evidence for our aesthetic experiences, or are they actually part of the definition of those experiences? The entry leans toward the former.
That example they give about the shimmering quality in Impressionist art really clarifies this. It's the experience quality that's aesthetically relevant, not the specific neural mechanism behind it.
So, knowing how the brain produces that shimmer doesn't change the aesthetic experience itself. Okay, now for authenticity. You have that Kant-inspired view, aesthetic empiricism, which says aesthetics is all about appearance, not how things really are.
Which would suggest authenticity doesn't matter, right? But then the entry points out how much our interest in art is tied up with its history and creation.
Like Sibley's examples of delicate and dynamic, those properties seem to depend on how something was made, not just how it looks.
And Walton argues that even visually identical works can have different aesthetic properties based on their category, like a painting versus an accidental mark.
And the entry connects this to the maker's achievement. What's impressive for one artist might be totally different for another, given their context and skills.
So valuing the work is tied to valuing the maker, which explains why authenticity can be aesthetically relevant.
Then they bring up that psychological concept of contagion, the idea that a person's essence can transfer to an object.
But the entry points out that this doesn't really explain art value. Like, Picasso's Guernica is way more valuable than a napkin he used, even though the napkin was physically closer to him.
Bloom and colleagues offer a different explanation. Valuing originals is about appreciating the creative act itself, not just the object.
And then there's the effort heuristic, where we tend to value things more if we think they took a lot of effort to create, even if we're not consciously aware of it.
Next up, pictures, imagination, and perception. The entry starts with Wollheim's idea that seeing the subject in the picture is key to pictorial representation.
And then it goes through different theories about what that seeing in actually involves, asking whether cognitive science can help us decide between them.
It seems like these theories have some testable implications, especially around how perception and imagination interact when we look at pictures. But finding neural correlates for imagination is still a huge challenge.
The entry suggests that imagination might not have its own dedicated brain regions, but rather repurposes systems that evolved for other things. This connects to that debate about how we understand other minds theory versus simulation theory.
And the entry hints that the simulation approach, where we kind of run mental simulations to understand others, might explain how we get so engrossed in fictional worlds.
Which also raises questions about how our minds are structured to allow for that immersion and why we sometimes resist engaging with morally problematic fiction.
But the entry also points out that most of this stuff about the cognitive underpinnings of imagination is still pretty speculative. Except for one interesting finding. There's evidence for Wollheim's twofoldness in picture perception, that we see both the surface of the picture and the depicted content.
Studies of people with certain brain lesions support this, showing that they can have trouble recognizing what's in a picture without problems seeing its surface features.
So that's a case where neuroscience actually provides some support for a philosophical claim. Okay, now for emotion and aesthetics. First up, how do we explain our emotional responses to fictional stuff?
Like, if we feel pity for Anna Karenina, is that a real emotion even though she doesn't exist? The entry points out that genuine emotion might require believing in the object of that emotion.
Which brings us to Walton's quasi-emotions. We have the physical and mental reactions, but they're not full-fledged emotions because we don't believe in the fictional world.
But then Gendler and Kavakovic argue that belief might not be necessary for all emotions. Our emotional systems evolve to respond to threats, whether real or imagined.
So maybe our fear of a fictional monster isn't that different from our fear of a real one, at least on a basic level.
Right. And then there's music. We say sad music makes us sad, but how does that work when there's no real-world reason for sadness?
Kivi argues that any sadness we feel while listening to music for its own sake is irrelevant to appreciating it. He thinks we should focus on the music's formal and expressive qualities, not our personal feelings.
But some researchers have challenged this, showing that music does reliably evoke emotions. But Kivi argues back, saying those studies don't capture the ideal way of listening to music.
It's tricky to test these things empirically. And then you have formalism in aesthetics, which is generally skeptical about the role of emotions in art. But what about the paradox of tragedy? Why do we enjoy art that makes us feel bad?
Quasi-emotions don't really explain that because even a quasi-fear is still unpleasant. So the entry presents three main positions: compensation, conversion, and neutrality.
Compensation says we tolerate negative emotions because of the other benefits art provides, like insights. Conversion says those emotions somehow transform into something positive within the artistic context. And neutrality says they're not actually unpleasant in the first place.
The entry mentions some research on hedonic flip, where pain can become pleasurable under certain conditions, as possible support for conversion. And it also lists various compensatory benefits, like moral and social learning.
The distancing embracing model tries to explain how we engage with negative emotions in art, but its theoretical basis is a bit unclear. And Matt Travers argues that we don't even need imagination to understand fiction, just mental models.
Okay, now for the aesthetics of literature. The entry notes that there's been some tension between literary studies and cognitive aesthetic inquiry.
Like, can we actually learn about the world from literature? Deconstructionists and postmodernists are pretty skeptical about that.
And even if literature does have cognitive benefits, do those benefits matter aesthetically? That's a debate.
But there's that strong intuition that great literature does offer insights into human nature. We value writers like Shakespeare for their wisdom.
And there's been research on the cognitive benefits of literature, like empathy and theory of mind, but the results are mixed.
And then there's the question of whether literary language is somehow special. Relevance theory argues that it's not, that poetic effects just arise naturally in communication.
Like the idea of weak implicature, where meaning is intentionally left vague, suggests that the difference between everyday language and poetic language might be a matter of degree, not kind.
Last but not least, aesthetics and evolution. The fossil record can only tell us so much, but the entry says that artifacts like stone tools can give us clues about early cognitive abilities.
And the big questions are, does art have a biological basis, or is it purely cultural? And is it an adaptation or a byproduct of something else?
The entry emphasizes that biological and cultural evolution are intertwined, and there's debate about whether art and aesthetic are universal concepts.
But we do have evidence of early aesthetic activity, like those Indonesian cave paintings and the symmetry in Acheulean hand axes.
Some argue that hand axe symmetry was about sexual selection or signaling trustworthiness, but there are also criticisms of those views.
And then there's bodily symmetry, especially facial symmetry, as a potential indicator of health and fitness, which might influence our preferences. But finding strong evidence for that link has been difficult.
The entry also raises the possibility that art might not be an adaptation at all, but rather a culturally invented technology, like writing.
And they discuss how kids seem to engage with aesthetic activities like drawing much more easily than learning things like writing.
So maybe some of our aesthetic abilities are socially learned, not innate. And the Baldwin effect might explain how learned traits could eventually become heritable.
The bottom line is that the origins of our aesthetic interests are probably super complex and go way back in time.
But is art an adaptation or a byproduct? Pinker famously argues it's the latter, but others think it evolved for social bonding or made choice.
Prum offers another view, seeing human aesthetic activity as part of a continuum with signaling in nature.
The entry questions whether figuring out art's adaptive function would even tell us that much about its aesthetic value. What matters more is how we actually experience and value it now.
And they point out that different art forms might have different evolutionary histories and purposes.
Finally, we get to environmental aesthetics. The entry notes that some research uses pictures instead of actual environments, which might limit the findings.
Kaplan and Talbot's work focuses on finding general preferences across different groups, like that often cited preference for savanna landscapes, which some think might be evolutionarily based.
But Carlson argues that appreciating nature properly requires understanding natural kinds and their histories. So just enjoying a pretty view might not be enough.
Budd challenges that, saying we don't need deep knowledge to enjoy things like a bird's flight. The entry then connects those 18th century ideas of the sublime and the picturesque with recent research on awe.
So the sublime is like an aesthetic form of awe, this feeling we get from vastness that challenges our understanding.
There is evidence that awe is expressed similarly across cultures, and that it's linked to a diminished sense of self.
So there you have it. As we've seen, the relationship between philosophical aesthetics and cognitive science is super complex and fascinating.
For anyone who wants to really understand art and beauty, digging into how our minds work can offer a whole new perspective.
And this deep dive has hopefully given you a starting point for your own explorations. Keep thinking about these empirical findings and how they relate to your own aesthetic experiences and philosophical ideas.
Exactly.
And here's a final question for you to ponder. How should our understanding of what it means to act as a philosopher about art and beauty change in light of all this scientific evidence? Should we be giving these empirical insights more weight alongside traditional philosophical thinking?